Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the study of antiquity and the Middle Ages. As always, I am your host, Nick Barksdale, and today we are joined once again by Dr. Aaron Mayer. Many of you are going to be familiar with his work on the Philistines and the interviews he's done on the channel. I am very excited to say that this next series is going to deal with a subject that many of you have requested, and that is ancient Israel and the Israelites. Dr. Aaron Mayer, thank you so much for coming on today.
It's my pleasure, like always.
So let's talk religion. This is a subject that people really love, I myself included. If it's a religion, if I have the time, I enjoy reading about it. And there's nothing more fascinating than religion for me in the ancient Near East. And so that being said, let's talk ancient Israel, the Israelites, Judites, and religion. BR had asked, were they always monotheistic? Were they originally polytheistic, or was it not that simple, and did it vary according to region, town, and city?
Well, let's start with that. Most of what we know about Israel religion shows that it's very heavily influenced by Canaanite religion. So, for example, the names of the Canaanite gods, or some of the Canaanite gods, such as El and Baal, and are sometimes, and their attributes are incorporated in the biblical text into the attributes and even the name of the Israelite God. Now, the overall ideological framework of the Bible is that it's a God and one God only, and it's a God who has no form. The big question is that the original form of the Israelite religion, or what we're receiving, and those two things, is that something after many processes and many developments, and this is basically Second Temple Judaism, and we're taking it back towards the Iron Age. So we know that during the Iron Age there is evidence of use of depictions of the Israelite God. There's figurines, both male and female. So this aniconic Judaism that we're familiar with from later stages of Judaism is not exactly in place in Iron Age Judah and Israel. That said, there's a lot less iconography in Judah and Israel than you have in many of the surrounding cultures. So there is some sort of a difference. Now, as far as monotheism, both in the biblical text and here and there in some inscriptions and artifacts, there seems to be more than one God. Perhaps the god and a goddess and a couple. Perhaps Yahweh, the name of the Israelite God, and perhaps Asherah, according to some. Another thing is, both in the biblical text and in other evidence, they very often talk not of monotheism, but monotheism. That means that it's not that you don't believe that there are other gods, but the other gods are weak, or not strong, or insignificant. So the Bible talks about, it's not there is no other God always. Sometimes they talk, there is no God like our God. That means, there's the God of Ashur and the God of the Ammonites and the Edomites, but that's nothing compared to our God. Our God will beat them. So it appears that there may be in the stages and development of this idea of monotheism that from polytheism and belief in there are various gods, and perhaps an important God and his partner, and then belief that, oh yes, there are other gods, but they're peripheral to the actual belief that there's only one God. That's what we believe in. Now, the big question is, of course, when did that belief in monotheism appear? Did it appear already in the Iron Age? And if it appeared in the Iron Age, was it an internal development, or was it, for example, influenced by the Assyrians? Because in the late Iron Age, the Assyrians also have this phenomenon in which Assur is turned into a primary god. Other gods don't disappear, but he becomes elevated. There are some people who claim that perhaps hints to monotheism appeared in the period of Elamarna, when the god Aten was elevated first to being the most important, God in Egypt, and then some claim even to the only God of Egypt, but that was in the late Bronze Age, 350 years before, the time, time we're talking about mainly. Some people have claimed might be some connection with Zoroastrianism, and there is possibility of various influences. What we do know is that when you come out of the Iron Age and in the Persian and Hellenistic period, Judaism already is monotheistic. And the question is, when did that occur? When did the transition, go on? Is it already in the Iron Age? And if in the Iron Age, perhaps, as in the question, there were those who believed in it and those who didn't believe in it. And perhaps the biblical text represents those who didn't believe in it. Those who did believe in monotheism. And the archaeology shows us that there were other, interpretations around. So I think we have this very complex formation of monotheism, and it's very hard to put your finger on the point, whether it's somewhere in the late Iron Age or later, that we can start talking about a really pure, clear-cut monotheism.
And so I've seen this a lot online, and you can read articles on the subject, so on and so forth, but I feel like this needs to be in YouTube as well. And that is my own personal question. How old is Judaism?
Well, depends on what you define Judaism. Because Judaism as we know it today, rabbinic Judaism or the various forms of Judaism that we know today, are based on traditions that go back thousands and thousands of years. Now, for example, we have ample textual and archaeological and physical evidence of Judaism from now backwards, back into the time of the Hellenistic period. No question about it. Now, even so, the traditions that were on the ground during the Hellenistic and Roman period have evolved, and they're very different from what's currently professed by the various types of Judaism. But they're still the same. It's still the same religion that's developed over time, and no religion stays the same. If you look at Catholicism today or Islam today and compare it to what it was centuries ago, it has gone through a process of development. Now, once you start going further back, before the Hellenistic period, we can see the connections and the continuity, but there's a lot more evidence of major changes that occur. So, for example, that's why many, many people will talk about Israelite religion up to the end of the Iron Age and talk about Judaism from the Persian period onwards, because it is a continuity, but there's a lot of change, a lot of development, a lot of major things that have gone on in that period. And again, it's not a clear-cut, here it went here. It's an ongoing process that's slowly changed with many, many undercurrents and many, many different viewpoints that every once in a while a certain viewpoint became, more prominent. And then, for example, rabbinic Judaism of today, to a large extent, is the continuity of a specific faction in Second Temple, early Roman period Judaism. And while others sort of, went into the dustbin of history. So that's how, things never stay the same. They develop and their influence, et cetera. So, but I think you can talk about that. There is a clear-cut cultural connection between traditions that existed in the Judite and Israelite kingdoms in the Iron Age up until Judaism and today. It's completely different. And if you would take an observant Jew today and put him in a time tunnel and take him back to Jerusalem in the Iron Age and show him the temple, he would probably have apoplexy and die, because it's so different. But nevertheless, you can trace the continuity and the traditions that as they evolved.
And that pretty much confirms my thought as well. I mean, if I were to look it up on, let's say, Britannica, for example, it really gives you the example that it's really not black and white, right? And there's so much continuity between, ancient Israel and their religion and what we have today. And so it's really awesome that you were able to clarify on that. Now, what do we know? And this is a broad question, and that is, what do we know about ancient Israelite religion and religious practices? Did it vary also according to city and region, or was there more of a clear-cut practice and belief?
Well, in the Iron Age, you could talk about, I would say, grossly speaking, of traditions of the Israelite kingdom and the Judite kingdom. But then you could also talk about urban traditions and rural traditions, official religion and family religion. There's a lot of variations. And of course, if you're at a site which is on the border between the area where the Philistines live and the area where the Judites live, and there's an intermixture between them, what does it tell us? Who are they? What are they? Are they mixing between mix and match? So it's not always simple. And I think in general, we would like to think of things being very uniform because it makes it easy to understand. But even today, even though like the Pope will declare that all Catholics do this and this and this, not all Catholics do this and this and that. Yeah.
So Troy Von Clemens had asked, what do we know about the history of Yahweh, and how did it evolve in Israel over time?
There are a couple of Egyptian sources from the late Bronze Age which may mention tribes of Yahweh or something like that. So Yahweh was a god that existed apparently in the late Bronze Age, but he wasn't a very central and important god. He's not mentioned in any way extensively in any of the Canaanite texts or significantly in Egyptian texts. So he apparently was a god of a very specific group of people, and they probably were one of the main components of Israel. Now, interestingly, the name Israel, the L ending, is another god. But Yahweh became the important god. Now, what happened with time, according in Israelite religion, Yahweh took on names and attributes of other gods and incorporated into his identity. So it could very well be that there was a group who believed in a god named Yahweh, and there were groups that believed in other gods, and they got together, and over time, the Yahweh became the important god. Now, by the way, for example, in the Northern Kingdom, they pronounce Yahweh in a different way than in the Southern Kingdom. So it might indicate, different traditions about that God. It's a very complex, and again, our vision of Yahweh as the single God, that may be very much influenced by later understandings of who this God was. And when we're projecting this back into the Iron Age.
That is really interesting. Actually, I think a lot of people are really going to find this very insightful. That is great. Is there a link, Verum Rex had asked, in your opinion, between Zoroastrianism and Old Testament religious beliefs?
Well, first of all, when you compare the history of, let's say, Iron Age Israel and Zoroastrianism, so they appear more or less at the same time. But if I remember correctly, the earliest Zoroastric texts are from the 5th or 6th century BCE. So we're talking about at the very end of the Iron Age or even post-Iron Age. So that said, in the Persian period, that means the late 6th, 5th, 4th century BCE, the Persian Empire, which was substantially, of the substantial part, at least at important parts of it were that Zoroastrianism was the main religion. They controlled the land of Israel, and they were both controlling people of Judah who were in the land of Israel, but they were also controlling areas where exiles from the Israelite and Judite kingdom were in Babylonia and beyond. So there was probably interface from that time onwards, and we know that there was an interface between Jews living in Babylonia and Persia, also in the Hellenistic and Roman period. So there has, over the ages, been a lot of interface, at least, neighbor, and there's all kinds of aspects of interface between Iranian traditions and Jewish traditions. There's a whole field of research that deals with that. Now, there have been various claims that monotheism came from that, and the concept of good and bad, and the importance of fire, and all kinds of aspects. So one of the things is, people are always looking for, what's the influence of that? Can we always put out everything? Basically, everything is influenced by everything. And you can always find some sort of influence on something. So I would say probably Persian traditions, including Zoroastrianism, did come in contact with Jewish traditions, and there might have been, bidirectional influences. I don't think, though, there are good chances that this influence occurred already in the Iron Age. It probably occurred, if it did occur, it occurred post-Iron Age. And then again, the question is how deep and how profound these connections were, and that's already a more problematic issue.
Do you think that Akhenaten's attempt at a form of monotheism could have had an impact on Canaan as well, or no?
It has been suggested, and for example, the famous one is Freud. Suggested this in his book. What do you call it? Moses and Monotheism, or something like that. That's the name of the book. That there is some connection, that a tradition of monotheism entered Israel through the concepts that were used in Egypt during the Amarna period. The only problem with that is that that's in the middle of the 14th century BCE, and evidence of monotheism in Israel. Even if we look at the biblical thing, and we say that it occurred sometime in the, right before the Israelites came into the land, under Moses. That's in the mid 13th, late 13th, early 12th century. So there's quite a distance between the two. And not to mention that archaeologically, it would seem to be that monotheism really becomes more and more on the ground only in the later Iron Age. So it's a little hard to make that connection. That said, you never know. You could have undercurrents of ideas that don't appear in the official texts, whether in Egypt and other places, that exist. We're dependent on such a small portion of what's actually going on in the past. So who are we to say that it's impossible that the concept of monotheism wasn't out there?
That's a good point. I knew I needed to bring that up because I know that some of my subscribers would have instantly brought up Akhenaten and his attempt at monotheism. So that's interesting. I'm glad we were able to go ahead and cover that briefly. Now, here's another subject that I really enjoy, and that is religion and violence. And there's a lot of scholarship done. It's really fascinating, regardless of what culture, regardless of the people. And the Old Testament, in many ways, depicts a world of religious harmony that in many ways erupts into religious violence or military violence combined with religion. And I was wondering, how common was religious violence in ancient Israel, and how divided was Israel on the subject of religion, if we even know?
Well, I think you have to remember that antiquity was a violent place. And although the effectivity of weapons was not as it was today, but violence was there all the time. And there are studies that talk about how that even if you take into account the millions that were killed in the last 100 years in world wars and all, etc., the world has become a less violent place over the centuries. And there's no question that violence was rife in any society wherever you did it, and if you could kill your enemy, you kill them. It's bottom line. And I think a lot of that's depicted in the biblical text about religious-related violence is either religious justification of things that occurred due to military conflict, or ideological wishes that this is what will happen to my enemy, or I kill my enemy and I do a horrible thing, so I have to justify it, with some religious story. But I think one of the things is that if you remember when just a few years ago when ISIS started executing people left and right, in the most horrendous manners, and to our modern perceptions of what's fair play in war and what do you do with prisoners, etc. It was so, jarring, but they were just doing what people did 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago. It's just, it wasn't, we didn't have television coverage of it then. And I think I think a lot of the way we try to understand the past is either, on the one hand, turn them into these perfect people who lived this perfect life, they had these perfect ideals, etc. Or on the other hand, they were these horrible barbarians who did ethnic cleansing. They were people who were living very complex, difficult lives, and they had to fight for their survival, and they fought tooth and nail, and sometimes in what we would consider very, very atrocious manners. And that was life, I think in general, there's this inclination to sort of see the past either as very rosy or very horrible, and it was a combination of all of it at the same time. So I know I made a comment about the paleo diet in one of the previous things, and a lot of people got mad about that. So I think that's part of it. Painting this rosy picture, which is very often based on your ideology and interpreting the past, is problematic. There's this great poem, which was turned into a book. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently. And they did things very differently from the way we do it, and they understood it very differently, and trying to impose our understandings and our ideologies on the past is exactly that, in imposing our ideologies and understanding on the past. So, for example, looking at the biblical text, how the Israelites slaughtered the Canaanites when Joshua conquered the land. First of all, did that conquest even occur? If some of it occurred, what happened? And what is it saying that the Israelites want to ethnically cleanse their enemies? Perhaps it's a reaction to someone who did that to them. Who knows? But just to say simplistically, and make your comparisons between the biblical text there and modern day events today, it's mixing between things that shouldn't be mixed. Yeah.
Now, let's talk about another particular favorite subject, and that is sacrifice, and not just referring to animals per se, but the topic of human sacrifice as well when it comes to ancient religion. Do we have any evidence at all for human sacrifice within the borders or regions of what we consider ancient Israel to be? And if so, is that due to the Israelites or possibly due to florid borders of their neighbors?
There's a very strong tradition in Roman sources, but also in archaeological remains relating to the Phoenicians of the Tophet. And according to that, the Phoenicians sacrificed infants to a god, and according to the Roman depiction, they were thrown into a fire or something of the sort. And there have been found several cemeteries in various Phoenician sites, both in Lebanon, perhaps in northern Israel, there's perhaps a hint, and also, for example, in Carthage and other Phoenician sites in the Mediterranean, where it has been suggested that this was evidence of this infant sacrifice. Now, there's debate about this. Some scholars accept it, some scholars don't accept it. But the biblical tradition is very clear in talking about that the Phoenicians burnt their babies, sacrificed their children, and there is a biblical narrative saying that this tradition also came to Jerusalem in the late Iron Age and castigating it. That this is a horrible thing that shouldn't be done. So there seems to be a tradition that there was some sort of infant sacrifice practiced by some people in Iron Age Judah, but we don't have any evidence of this archaeologically, and we don't have any evidence of other types of human sacrifice in Israel or Judah during the Iron Age. Does that mean that it didn't occur at all? It's hard to say, but it's not something that it's for sure. I mean, if you think of the biblical text, the one place where supposedly they were about to do a human sacrifice is Abraham and Isaac, on the Mount Moriah. But that's put out there as sort of like the horrendous thing that he's about to do because the God said, etc. And in the end, he doesn't do it. So again, the question is, what was the writer trying to convey there? You could argue that he was trying to convey that they're very much against that type of behavior. And again, we don't have any other substantial evidence of this, and archaeologically, we don't have it as well. On the other hand, in other ancient cultures, whether it's to a certain extent here and there in Egypt, to a certain extent here and there in Sumer, and Minoan Crete, and other places, there are hints of human sacrifice. So, sometimes it's archaeologically visible. We don't have anything that tells us about this in Iron Age Judah or Israel.
If you read like the Old Testament, you see like Jericho, for example, only one family is spared, and you're not supposed to take anything from the city, right? It's the one guy who does causes a military disaster, and it's like the city of Jericho, and realistically everything in it is supposed to be almost like an offering, right, to their God. And Saul, I think it's is it the Ammonite king that he spares?
Yep. He does.
The supposed supernatural, I guess, curse on Saul because he doesn't obey, the commands given him by
to kill the king. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting. And it's like, one, there's the big debate. Did this even happen? Did Jericho even happen? But it's interesting to see this form of, I guess you could say, arguably this religious awareness, I guess, involving violence, if that makes sense. I don't know. It's hard to put that in words. If that.
Well, I think isn't all violence and let's say called state sanctioned or politically sanctioned violence in antiquity and until today is very often intermeshed with religion, because religion gives you the ideology in which you can exist. It enables you to explain your daily life, and it also enables you to explain horrible situations, whether you win them or you lose them. You still try to explain them using your religion. So if you in the context of a religious explanation of events in a war, you also explain it that way. So I think it's just it's integrating. In antiquity, as in many traditional societies, there's no separation between life and religion. It's all intermeshed, and you get up from the moment you wake up until the moment you go to sleep. Your daily life is intermeshed with your religious beliefs and practices. So I think it also goes for your conduct in war.
But on this little topic, because I feel like this is a really interesting one, whenever Saul doesn't kill the king and spare some of the livestock and stuff like that, was it a prophet or judge that had told him he was supposed to? I can't remember.
Samuel. Samuel. Yeah.
Do you feel like this could be a reference to almost a power struggle between a priestly class and the kingship?
Very much so. Listen, the way the biblical text describes the appearance of the monarchy as a struggle between various classes. So I'm sure this is something that existed. And as I said before, it's the kingship in antiquity and in ancient Israel was not this one charismatic figure that controlled everything, but he had to muscle his way into the position based on charismatic leadership and coalition politics. And I'm sure he had to convince or overcome other people who had claims to leadership as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today at the study of antiquity and the Middle Ages. I hope you've enjoyed what we've done so far. This is actually just the first part of the series on ancient Israel. We've got more stuff coming, so stick with us. It's going to be absolutely fantastic. I can't wait to get into more. And Dr. Aaron Mayer, thank you so much for coming on today.
My pleasure. Great to be here.